The clash is over. The shouting fades. The battlefield, once alive with the fury of swords and screams, has fallen into an eerie silence. Only the groans of the dying break through the still air. The dead are lucky. Their pain is over. But for the ones still breathing, still bleeding, survival is not victory. It is a sentence. Picture it. A Roman soldier, chest heaving, his armor pierced, his flesh torn open. He stares at the sky, not with relief but with terror. Around him lie the bodies of his brothers, already cold, already gone. He is alive, but every heartbeat feels like betrayal. Every gasp of air a curse. Because in Rome, death on the battlefield was honored. A clean death meant glory, remembrance, a name carved into the annals of the empire. But survival meant something else entirely. It meant infection, agony, mutilation, abandonment. It meant returning home as a ghost of the man you once were, shunned by the very society you fought for. This is the story Rome never carved into its marble monuments. The story of the men who did not die in battle, but who carried their battles inside their mangled bodies for the rest of their lives. The forgotten legionaries whose survival was worse than death itself. And tonight you will walk with them through the blood-soaked mud of the battlefield, into the crude hospitals where screams echoed louder than prayers, into the lonely silence of veterans discarded by the empire they served. Because Rome's true cost was not measured in the dead, but in the broken. And it is their story untold, unbearable, unforgettable that we will now uncover. Rome did not fight its wars from a distance. There were no gunpowder blasts, no long-range weapons that spared men the intimacy of slaughter. A Roman battle was fought face to face, flesh against steel, where the only safety was the death of the man in front of you. The weapon of choice, the gladius, short, efficient, and designed not to slash but to stab. In the chaos of the battlefield, legionaries thrust upward, piercing through stomachs, lungs, hearts. Wounds were precise but never clean. The gladius left men writhing in agony, organs spilling, air bubbling through punctured lungs. It was not a weapon of mercy. It was a weapon of certainty. Behind the first lines came the storm of pila, heavy Roman javelins with soft iron tips that bent on impact. Once they pierced a man's body or shield, they stayed lodged, tearing deeper with every movement. For many soldiers, a pilum strike was not instantly fatal. It left them crippled, skewered, staggering until they collapsed. Their comrades forced to step over them. And then came the siege weapons. The ballista launching iron bolts that tore through multiple men at once. The Scorpio spitting missiles faster than a heartbeat. The onager hurling stones that crushed skulls, shattered ribs, and left bodies mangled beyond recognition. To survive one of these blows was not to live, it was to endure. But Rome's true genius of killing was not in its weapons alone. It was in its formations. The legions created kill zones, calculated fields of death. Picture the field at Cannae 216 BC. 50,000 Romans surrounded by Hannibal's forces. The Carthaginian double envelopment trapped them in a shrinking circle of blood. Soldiers were so tightly packed they could not even raise their arms to fight. Many suffocated standing up, crushed by their own comrades, never even struck by a blade. Or Tuttleberg Forest 9 AD. 3 Roman legions lured into the Germanic woods, ambushed on every side. Arrows rained from the canopy, spears thrust from behind trees. Men were cut off in small groups, hacked apart in mud and rain, screaming for officers who never came. Out of 20,000, almost none survived. Those who did were enslaved, tortured, or sacrificed to foreign gods. In these killing grounds, the dead were honored. They fell with their comrades, their names remembered in victory or lamented in defeat. But the wounded, the men who lived with their guts hanging out, who crawled through the mud, begging for water, they were not celebrated. They were burdens, obstacles for the legion to step over, delays in the march of conquest. For Rome, a soldier was useful only as long as he could fight. A wounded man consumed resources, slowed down the advance, weakened morale. He was, in the cold calculus of empire, an inconvenience. And this is where survival begins to look far darker than death. To die on the field meant glory, remembrance, and honorable funeral. To survive, torn, bleeding, screaming, meant being carried into a life where agony would not end when the battle did. Most people only hear about Rome's victories, not the soldiers who suffered for them. If you don't subscribe to Disturbing Tale, you're choosing to silence the forgotten voices of history. And if you refuse, at least tell us in the comments why their pain isn't worth remembering. The clash of steel may have ended, but the battlefield remained alive, not with victory but with agony. When the dust settled and the trumpet signaled Rome's triumph, what lingered was not silence, but the sound of men caught between life and death. Imagine the scene. The ground is a carpet of corpses twisted in unnatural poses, armor dented, weapons shattered. Among them the wounded still move. Some crawl desperately toward streams, leaving trails of blood in the dirt. Others clutch their stomachs, trying to push their insides back into their bodies. Some simply lie still, whispering prayers to Mars, to Jupiter, to anyone who might give them mercy. But mercy rarely came. Rome did not rush to the aid of the broken. The legion's first priority after battle was order, not compassion. Standards had to be recovered, officers accounted for, the enemy pursued. Only after these tasks were secured would attention turn to the survivors. By then many were already gone, drowned in their own blood or trampled by comrades marching forward. Even those fortunate enough to be found faced horror. There was no triage, no organized rescue. Soldiers too injured to walk were dragged across the mud by their cloaks or spears shoved under their bodies as makeshift stretchers. If they were unlucky, they were left behind until nightfall when scavengers, both human and animal, prowled the field. Wolves, crows, and desperate looters saw no difference between the dead and the dying. The survivors often prayed for unconsciousness, but pain was relentless. Flies swarmed open wounds, laying eggs in still living flesh. The stench of excrement, blood, and burning would mix with the cries of men begging for water that never came. Some Romans, unable to bear the torment, pulled hidden daggers from their belts and ended their own lives. Others asked their comrades for the mercy stroke, a final thrust of the gladius through the throat or heart. But not every plea was granted. Rome's discipline was strict. To kill a comrade even out of mercy could be seen as desertion of duty. And so many suffered on. Not allowed to die, not allowed to live. This was the truth of Rome's victories. Fields where the living envied the dead. Surviving the battlefield was only the beginning. For the wounded, a new torment awaited. The journey away from the field of slaughter. There were no well-built ambulances, no cushioned wagons waiting to carry them. Transporting the wounded was as brutal as the battle itself. Stretchers were improvised from whatever could be found, shields lashed together, spears tied with cloaks, or doors ripped from nearby villages. These makeshift litters cut into flesh, pressed bone against torn muscle, and offered no comfort to men already hanging by a thread. Those too badly injured to be carried were thrown into wagons without suspension. Crude carts pulled by oxen over stone-paved roads and dirt tracks scarred by rain and ruts. Every bump, every jolt was a new wound. Broken ribs pierced deeper into lungs. Shattered bones ground against each other. Blood gushed from injuries that had barely clotted. For some, the journey killed more swiftly than the enemy's sword ever could. The sounds of transport were as haunting as the battlefield itself. The creak of wooden wheels mixed with the groans of men, their screams tearing through the night as wagons rolled over uneven stones. Soldiers who survived the battlefield often begged to die before they reached camp. Many pleaded with their comrades to leave them behind to spare them the torment of being dragged mile after mile with their bodies shaking apart inside them. And still the legion moved forward. Rome was efficient but never compassionate. The priority was the advance of the army, the securing of territory, the glory of conquest. The broken men groaning on stretchers and wagons were not the focus. They were baggage to be carried only as long as they did not slow the machine of empire. Some who could no longer endure simply let go. They loosened their grip on life, surrendered to the darkness, and died along the road. For them death was mercy. For those who clung on, every mile was another descent into a living hell. These men carried the weight of the empire on their shattered bodies. If you can't even click subscribe for disturbing tale, then maybe you belong among those who abandoned them on the roadside. Or prove me wrong in the comments. When the wounded finally reached safety, if safety is the right word, their trials did not end. They were delivered into the hands of Rome's Medici, the military physicians of the legions. These were not healers in the sense we imagine today. They were pragmatists, men trained to do one thing, keep a soldier alive just long enough to return to duty or to decide when a body was no longer worth saving. Every large Roman camp contained a valetudinarium, a military hospital. At first glance, it might appear advanced for its time with separate wards for open wounds, fevers, and recovery. But the reality inside those walls was a theater of suffering. Wooden beds lined the rooms, their frames permanently stained with blood. Buckets of water and vinegar stood ready, not for cleanliness, but for rinsing gore from instruments that were used again and again on man after man. The tools of the medic were crude but terrifyingly effective. Bronze scalpels for cutting into flesh. Hooks of iron for prying open wounds or fishing for arrowheads. Forceps to pull out shattered bone fragments. And when infection spread or bleeding would not stop, there was the saw, a heavy serrated blade designed to take a limb in minutes. There were no delicate incisions. Surgery was not an art. It was a battle fought against time with fire and iron as the only allies. Pain relief was as primitive as the tools themselves. A soldier might be given strong wine to dull the senses or a handful of crushed herbs, opium from the east, mandrake root from the Mediterranean, but doses were uncertain and relief was partial at best. Some men slipped into stupors, muttering half-formed prayers as their bodies were carved open. Others screamed until their voices broke, their cries echoing through the entire camp. The Roman physician Galen, who treated gladiators before serving in the army, wrote in his accounts about amputations performed without hesitation. He described holding a man's flesh with hooks, cutting swiftly through muscle, and then sawing through bone as assistants restrained the soldier by force. Cauterization followed. Red-hot iron pressed into the wound to seal vessels and burn away infection. The smell of burning flesh was said to linger for hours, clinging to walls, bedding, and even the skin of those nearby. And yet, for many, this ordeal was not a path to survival, but to an early grave. The odds were cruel. Blood loss, shock, or infection often claimed the patient within days. Some never regained consciousness after their operation. Others lingered, feverish and delirious, their bodies rotting even as their hearts still beat. The Medici did what they could, but in truth they were deciding who would live long enough to fight again and who would be discarded as unfit. Inside the Validinarium, survival was not guaranteed. It was a gamble. For every soldier who left with a scar, another left only as a corpse. The battlefield was merciless, but the hospital could be worse. Because here the soldier's suffering was drawn out under the cold gaze of men who measured life not in compassion, but in utility. For the soldier who survived the blade, the spear, and even the surgeon's saw, another enemy waited, one far more cruel than steel. It could not be seen on the battlefield. It did not carry a weapon, wear armor, or shout in rage. Yet, it claimed more Roman soldiers than any barbarian horde ever could. Infection. The Romans had no knowledge of germ theory. They did not know that the soil they fought upon was teeming with invisible killers, that the surgeon's tools carried death from one body to another, that the very bandages meant to protect a wound were often soaked with filth. To them, wounds festered because of imbalances in the body, bad air, or divine punishment. But ignorance did not soften the reality. Gangrene was the most feared of all. At first, a soldier might notice a wound refusing to close, its edges swollen and red. Soon the skin turned black, the stench of rotting flesh announcing the infection before the fever even began. Maggots sometimes appeared in the wound, writhing in living tissue. To touch the skin was to feel death already setting in. Tetanus struck differently. A small puncture barely noticeable in the chaos of battle could tighten into a death sentence. Days later, the man's jaw would lock, his body stiffen, and spasms would contort him until his spine bent unnaturally. He remained fully conscious, trapped inside a body twisting itself into agony until his lungs finally failed. And then there was septicemia, blood poisoning, the invisible fire that consumed from within. A soldier might wake one morning drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, his body shivering even in summer heat. Hallucinations followed, visions of comrades long dead, of gods demanding sacrifice, of shadows pressing in from every corner. By the time his mind gave way, his body was already lost. The hospital's wrire of this unseen war. The smell of infection hung heavy in the air, sour, sickly, unmistakable. It clung to the hands of the Madush, to the beds where soldiers writhed, to the very walls of the Validinarium. It was a smell Rome could not banish because it was the smell of empire built on human flesh rotting before its time. Herbal remedies offered little. Garlic compresses, elder leaves, rue, and wine were pressed into wounds in desperate attempts to soothe the swelling. Dioscorides recommended mixtures of honey and resin to cleanse infected flesh. Galen praised the use of vinegar to wash cuts. Sometimes these treatments slowed the spread. More often they only delayed the inevitable. There were no antibiotics, no miracle cures. What we cured today with a handful of pills claimed entire legions in antiquity. Survival was not a question of strength or willpower. Infection showed no mercy to bravery. Decorated veterans died just as swiftly as raw recruits. The empire could train men to conquer nations, but it could not protect them from the tiniest enemies in the soil beneath their feet. And so the wounded lived in terror, not of battle, but of the days after. Because survival meant waiting. Waiting to see if the wound would close or if the flesh would blacken, if the fever would break or burn endlessly, if they would wake tomorrow or not at all. For many, this waiting was worse than dying outright. If you can stomach hearing about infection eating men alive, but you can't stomach clicking one button to subscribe, Maybe you're no different than Rome itself, using their suffering for entertainment, then discarding it. Defend your choice in the comments if you disagree. Not every wound could be seen. Some soldiers returned with their limbs intact, their armor polished, their bodies unscarred, and yet inside they carried damage no physician could treat. The Romans had no name for it. Today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. In antiquity, it was invisible, and because it was invisible, it was despised. Writings of men like Tacitus reveal veterans who withdrew from public life, unable to celebrate or laugh as others did. They avoided festivals, shunned gatherings, recoiled from the sound of music or the clash of arms. Some could not even walk through crowded streets without feeling trapped, surrounded as if the enemy lurked just beyond the corner. Lucretius, the Roman poet, hinted at the endless torment of memory. He wrote of soldiers waking at night, hearts pounding, hands reaching for weapons that were no longer there, haunted by visions of battle long after the fighting was done. These were not just stories. They were glimpses into a reality Rome refused to acknowledge. For many, sleep became the cruelest enemy. The nights were filled with nightmares. Comrades screaming as they died, the weight of corpses pressing down, the sound of arrows tearing through flesh. Some woke in terror, convinced they were still trapped in the mud of Cannae or the forests of Tuttleburg. Others refused to sleep at all, pacing through the darkness until exhaustion dragged them into another nightmare. By day the mind fared no better. Paranoia nodded at them. A door slamming in the city could trigger the memory of a siege tower collapsing. The bark of a dog became the roar of barbarian war cries. Farmers in the countryside startled veterans into reaching for absent swords. And when their minds broke completely, violent outbursts followed. A husband struck his wife without knowing why. A father shouted at children for playing too loudly. Some turned on strangers in sudden fits of rage, unable to explain the fire inside them. But Rome did not see this as a wound. Rome saw it as weakness. The empire's ideal was virdice, manliness, endurance, the ability to suffer without complaint. A soldier was expected to endure pain with dignity, to suppress fear, to conquer not only the enemy but himself, to cry, to tremble, to confess inner torment. These were signs of failure. And failure had no place in the mythology of Rome. So the broken minds of veterans were hidden away. Families whispered of their instability. Communities shunned them. Many veterans isolated themselves entirely, living on the margins of towns or wandering the countryside, unable to fit back into the society they had fought to defend. Their silence was not chosen. It was demanded by a culture that worshipped strength and despised fragility. And for some, silence was not enough. The torment grew unbearable. Records hint at suicides among veterans, men who chose the sword, the rope, or the river rather than continue living with their nightmares. To Rome, these deaths were rarely honored. They were brushed aside, dismissed as weakness, forgotten as though they had never served. The empire built arches to honor generals, monuments to celebrate victories. But nowhere were carved the names of those who killed themselves in despair, who could not bear the weight of their memories. They were erased twice. Once by war and again by society. When the broken soldier could no longer fight, Rome decided his fate. But not all fates were equal. His future depended on which category of discharge he was granted. A judgment that could mean the difference between honor and humiliation, between survival and oblivion. The most coveted release was the missio inonesta, the honorable discharge. A soldier who endured his 20 to 25 years of service or who fought with such distinction that his name could not be ignored was rewarded. He received land, pensions, and recognition. If he was a foreigner, he might even be granted Roman citizenship, a prize worth more than gold. His name could appear on inscriptions, his service recorded, his children elevated by his sacrifice. But for the severely wounded, this honor was rare. Few broken men survived long enough to reach such rewards. Their suffering often ended long before the empire deemed their duty complete. For many, the end came under the msioazara, the medical discharge. This was given to those too mutilated to fight, too crippled to march, too shattered to serve. On paper it was called honorable. In reality it was abandonment. There was no land, no pension, no guaranteed future. A man missing a leg, blinded in one eye, or maimed beyond use, was sent home with nothing but scars. He became the responsibility of his family if he had one, or the pity of strangers if he did not. In practice he was cast aside, unfit for Rome's armies, unwanted by Rome's society. And then there was the darkest fate of all, the msignominiosa, the dishonorable discharge. Reserved for those accused of cowardice, desertion, or behavior deemed unworthy of a soldier. It was more than dismissal. It was erasure. The man expelled in ignominy lost every right he had fought for. No pension, no land, no recognition. His name was stricken from the rolls with contempt. His service meant nothing. In a culture obsessed with honor, this was not just punishment. It was a kind of death. Inscriptions carved into stone across the empire bear silent witness to these realities. In the provinces we find graves of proud veterans who list their legions, their campaigns, their years of service. These men received the mio onesta, and their names live on in marble. But just as telling are the absences, the countless soldiers who left no record at all. Their names never carved, their deeds never remembered, their sacrifices swallowed by silence. For many, discharge was not the end of service, but the beginning of a second battle, the fight for dignity in a world that no longer valued them. To be wounded was to risk being forgotten. To be dishonored was to be erased completely. And for too many Roman soldiers, the empire they bled for rewarded their survival with indifference, neglect, or shame. Rome erased the names of dishonored veterans from history. If you refuse to subscribe to Disturbing Tale, you're helping erase them again, or explain in the comments why they don't deserve to be remembered. For the wounded soldier who could no longer march with his legion, life after service was not a gift. It was a struggle, a daily fight to find purpose in a world that valued strength above all. Rome did not simply abandon every man who could not wield a sword. Some bodies, though broken, still had use. And so, a few survivors were reassigned within the machinery of the empire. A man who had lost the ability to fight but retained his mind might become a scribe, recording supply lists, payrolls, and orders. Others were made instructors, drilling raw recruits with the knowledge carved into their flesh from years of war. Some became guards for supply depots, armories, or watchtowers, where the demands of combat were lighter. These roles offered a fragile dignity, a chance to remain within the system that had consumed their youth, a way to live as a soldier without setting foot on the battlefield. But such opportunities were rare and never guaranteed. For every man who found a post behind a desk or a gate, there were many more cast adrift. Some turned to the shadows of the empire, selling their skills to whoever would pay. Mercenaries offered their swords to senators, governors, or wealthy merchants. They protected caravans crossing hostile frontiers, enforced debts in Roman cities, or fought private wars for aristocrats. For men who had already given their blood to Rome, this work was not loyalty. It was survival. Others found themselves in an even darker trade, the gladiatorial schools. Some wounded veterans, still strong enough to fight, chose the arena as their final battlefield. There in the sand of the amphitheater, violence became a profession once again. Fame, money, and fleeting glory tempted them, but the cost was steep. Death was entertainment, and for those who entered, survival was never the goal. Many fought not for pride but for bread. Their suffering was consumed by crowds who cheered, never knowing that the man before them had once fought for the empire itself. And then there were the most unlucky of all. Those with missing limbs, blinded eyes, or shattered bodies who could no longer fight, work, or teach. These men became beggars on the streets of Rome, Alexandria, or Carthage. They sat in the shadow of temples, in the corners of marketplaces, their scars on display for pity's sake. Once they had marched with the greatest army the world had ever seen. Now they begged for scraps in the city they had bled to defend. The contrast could not have been starker. Rome raised marble monuments to generals, triumphal arches to victories, statues to emperors. Their faces were carved in stone, immortalized in glory. But the wounded veterans, the men who made those victories possible, were left nameless in the dust. Their monuments were their scars. Their legacy was silence. Rome was an empire built on the backs of soldiers, and it knew it had to keep them loyal. To the legionaries marching for decades far from home, the promise of reward was the light that carried them through blood and terror. Augustus, the first emperor, understood this well. He created the Aeraria Militari, a military treasury funded by special taxes, designed to pay pensions to veterans. For a time it worked. Men who survived long enough to complete their service could look forward to land, money, and a measure of dignity. But promises in Rome were fragile, and emperors were not all alike. Some, like Vespasian, reinforced the system, ensuring that soldiers were compensated for their years of sacrifice. Others, like Nero, saw the treasury as their own purse. Money meant for veterans was drained into palaces, banquets, and endless games to entertain the masses. The soldiers who had bled for Rome were forced to wait, petition, and beg for pensions that often never came. In times of crisis, veterans were the first to be abandoned. When civil wars tore through the empire, when plague spread across provinces, when the treasury collapsed under debt, the funds promised to soldiers dried up. Veterans found themselves cheated of what they had earned. They returned home with broken bodies only to discover that the state had no intention of keeping its word. Some waited years for pensions that never arrived. Others were sent to distant colonies with promises of land that turned out to be barren, infertile, or already occupied. What was supposed to be a reward became another battle, this time not against enemies in the field, but against the very empire they had defended. The betrayal cut deep. For the men who had survived wounds, disease, and despair, Rome's neglect was the final wound, and perhaps the cruelest of all. Rome built monuments for emperors, but let its soldiers rot in alleys. If you walk away without subscribing to Disturbing Tale, you're no better than the emperors who spent money on palaces instead of pensions. If you won't join us, then leave your excuse in the comments. Let's hear why you'd rather forget them.